Okay, so we've talked about training in different formats and the learning process, etc. But now we need to talk about evaluating the effectiveness of training. Okay, because obviously, as we said, training costs a lot of money. Are we getting some bang for our buck? Uh-huh. So why do we need to evaluate training? Obviously, to determine whether or not the trainees have picked up what they're supposed to pick up. But also, we evaluate training so that we can make future training more effective, right? So that's a clear thing. And then finally, we got to justify the costs. Because, of course, human resources is the one that puts together the training, but training is probably mandated from above. So you need to justify that the cost of the training, the benefits of the training, and do a cost-benefit analysis. Okay? So when evaluating training, there are these 4 different criteria to evaluate the effectiveness of training. Reaction, learning, behavioral, and results criteria. And the first 2 are considered internal. That is to say, they are functions, things that are measured during the act of training, whereas the second 2 are external, and they are really the outcomes or the transfer of training kinds of things that we're talking about. Okay? So the internal criteria, as I said, reaction criteria and learning criteria. And so the reaction criteria is like, how do employees respond? What is their attitude towards the training? How do they react to the training? And yeah, every time I do training with our technology area, CETL, I get a feedback form, and the idea is you rate the trainer, you rate what do you feel, was it effective, this kind of a thing. Learning criteria, again, these are internal, it is during the active training. That is, at the end of the training, what was the score on the exam that they gave you to test your knowledge of the training, okay? So these are internal, which is lovely, and they become the focus of much training evaluation simply because they're easy to measure, okay? They are incredibly easy to quantify. You can capture this data during the training session, done and done, okay? External criteria are the ones that really should matter to an organization, because we've mentioned it many times. Just because you learn something doesn't mean you're going to use it, okay? We're going to come back to motivation later, by the way. And so these external criteria are the ones that ought to be the focus of training evaluation. But again, as I said, they're very, very difficult to access, okay? So behavioral criterion might be what we were talking about, transfer of training. That is, you learned a new behavior during training. Now, do you exhibit that behavior when you go to your job? Okay, so a behavioral change. But results, on the other hand, is the least tangible of them all. And that is like, did training result in increased customer satisfaction, right? It's like, did training lead to reductions in errors? Okay, so whatever your outcome is, and again, it's all, every one of these, productivity, cost savings, error reductions, increase, they're all job performance. Remember that, right? It's ultimately different versions of job performance. Well, training evaluation is done in, research design is done, and usually they're quasi-experiments. And if you remember, a quasi-experiment is something that might look like an experiment. It might have a control group and an experiment. Well, it wouldn't have those. But it smells kind of like an experiment in that you have levels of an independent variable, but you can't do random assignment. Okay, there's no random assignment. And so the most traditional quasi-experimental method for evaluating training would be a pre-test, post-test design. How many errors were made before training? How many errors were made after training? Okay, something of that nature. And so you can't randomly assign people to either training, or either they have had the training or they have not. Okay, but often what you're going to do is not just a pre-test, post-test design, but you're going to say, for example, in one division, we're going to do training. So we're going to do before and after and measure the difference. But then we'll go to a different division that did not receive training and measure them at time 1 and time 2. And so the idea is there's naturally going to be changes in the productivity of your organization, naturally, okay? And so by using a control group, you can isolate how much of the change that's occurring is a result of just natural change versus the result of the training itself, okay? And so ultimately, in the end, what should be done is a utility analysis, which is just a fancy way of saying cost-benefit, right? And so the different costs that might be involved would be equipment, facilities, personnel. It costs money to these companies that create these programs. So all of these costs are involved. What potential benefits? And it would be not just changes in productivity, but how long does it? If I do training and it increases productivity, but the increase in productivity disappears after 2 weeks, then it doesn't really help us, okay? If it increases productivity, but only for 1 or 2 employees, I don't think that's going to cut it. So you have to not just look at changes in job performance, but how long an impact is and how wide within the organization. Okay, so that's what we have for Unit 3, and so we're done with the I side, the industrial side, and in the next unit, we're going to be moving into the O side, the organizational side.